The following program contains mature content about crimes involving rape, murder, and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised.
Previously on Southern Nightmare.
The whole trial came down to whether or not the jury would accept the DNA as evidence. Because if they didn't, they were going to acquit him because they had no other evidence to rely on.
When people who were there look back at Timothy Wilson Spencer's capital murder trial for the killing of Sue Tucker, there's one moment in particular that sticks out in their memories. And it doesn't have anything to do with DNA or the veritable army of scientists with impressive credentials who were brought in to testify. For most of the trial, onlookers say, Spencer was disengaged, seemingly emotionless and disinterested as he sat at the defense table, wearing a pink pinstripe shirt, a burgundy tie, and gray slacks. But when photos of Sue Tucker's nude, badly decomposed body were being admitted into evidence, Timothy Spencer perked up, according to witnesses who were there, including Arlington County Prosecutor Helen Fahey and one of Spencer's own defense attorneys, Carl Womack.
The only time I really saw him show emotion was when Helen was showing the pictures to the jury. You know, it's like he craned his neck to look at the pictures. I mean, he made a real effort, you know. I was just sorry I hadn't said something to him. Everybody in the courtroom noticed it. You could not notice it. I was just upset, you know, it's like, Tim, this is not a good career move for you. You know, you do not want to be doing what you're doing.
Really didn't show much reaction to anything. When I was cross-examining him, he seemed to have more interest in the pictures than he had in much of the rest of the proceedings.
At the end of the trial, in the sentencing phase, the last witness on the stand would be Spencer himself. His defense attorneys were asking him softball questions about his upbringing and childhood hijinks, like when he got in trouble for setting a roll of toilet paper on fire in an elementary school bathroom. When Carl Womack asked Spencer if he was guilty, Spencer said, "I didn't kill those ladies, and I feel sorry for their families. I never killed those ladies, and I ask you not to sentence me to death." Then it was Helen Fahey's turn. On cross-examination, the Arlington prosecutor just had 3 questions for Timothy Spencer. "I show you Commonwealth's Exhibit 2P. Did you get a good look at that picture earlier?" "Yes, I did," Spencer replied. She asked him the exact same question about 2 other death scene photos. "Did you get a good look at that picture?" "Yes, I did," Spencer answered twice more. A few minutes later, when it came time to argue to the jury that Timothy Spencer deserved the death penalty, Helen Fahey brought those photos back up once again. "I would suggest," she told the jury, "that you think about Spencer's demeanor and his conduct during the course of this trial. None of you, none of us in this courtroom can look at those pictures without sorrow, without a certain horror, without revulsion. If you will recall when Officer Shomes stood in front of you and showed you the pictures of Susan Tucker, did the defendant look away? No. He wanted to get a good look at those pictures. He wanted to get a good look at those pictures because he wanted to see what it looked like, what Susan Tucker looked like, what his handiwork looked like 3 or 4 days later. He also looked at the pictures of Debbie Davis. He looked at the pictures of Susan Helms. None of us will ever understand why."
Helen walked up in the sentencing phase to the jury, stood in front of the jury, right in the middle of the jury, and opened her sentencing argument with, "Something is terribly wrong with Timothy Spencer." And she almost did not need to say anything else.
From True South Media in Richmond, Virginia, in cooperation with Style Weekly and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio, this is Southern Nightmare, the story of how the South Side Strangler was brought to justice. I'm your host, Richard Foster. Tomorrow, July 11th, the day after this episode launches, is the 30th anniversary of the opening day of Timothy Spencer's landmark summer 1988 capital murder trial. It would be the first and arguably most important of the 4 back-to-back capital murder trials that the accused serial killer would face over the next year. In addition to TV, newspaper, and magazine reporters, the courtroom gallery was also filled with the defense attorneys and prosecutors who would be arguing Spencer's 3 Richmond area capital murder trials. Everyone was there to see if the jury would deliver a conviction based on DNA evidence alone.
This is the first case in Virginia where genetic fingerprinting is being used to try and prove the case against an accused serial killer, Timothy Spencer. It may be the first time it's used in the nation. Scientists showed the jury slides so they could see for themselves if genes from Spencer's blood matched genes from semen stains found at a murder scene. The defense
But make no mistake, people were also there for Timothy Spencer to see for themselves what a monster looked like in person. Many of them were probably a little disappointed.
I think you have this idea that you would recognize someone as evil as that if you saw them. And he was just an ordinary person. He didn't really react to anything. He didn't look angry. He didn't look really anything.
In some way, I think that's almost scarier.
It is. It is scarier.
The 6-day trial came down almost completely to DNA. Aside from that, the only pieces of physical evidence connecting Timothy Spencer to Sue Tucker's murder were pubic hairs found at the murder scene and a shard of broken glass recovered from Spencer's camouflage jacket. Lab techs found the glass when processing Spencer's belongings, and an expert testified that the glass matched the laundry room window that the killer had broken at Sue Tucker's townhome. Another forensic expert said that the hairs recovered were microscopically consistent with Spencer's hair, but this sort of visual comparison analysis is generally considered outdated and inaccurate now. Helen Fahey's secret weapon in court was her deputy prosecutor, Art Karp. Unlike the average lawyer, Art held a bachelor's degree in physics and a master's in mathematics. He had been a systems analyst for the Navy for 20 years before he changed careers and got his law degree. Art was the type of guy who read science books for fun, and he was thrilled to be working on a trial that a lot of courtroom observers would later describe as being like attending a really heavy college science lecture.
What the case hinged on really was, it was sort of a battle of the experts, if you want. And keeping in mind that not only was the use of DNA very new, but it was very controversial. So the real problem from my point of view was, how do I go about convincing a jury that they should convict somebody of murder just on the basis of this technical thing that they had never heard anything about before.
As he was seeking experts to deliver testimony in the case, Art started at the top with Dr. James Watson, the Nobel Prize-winning molecular biologist who co-discovered the structure of DNA in 1953.
As a matter of fact, the first thing I did was I called Watson. And he was the one who, I said, would you come down and testify for us? He said no, but he recommended the expert. Yeah, that was exciting, I tell you. I still brag about that.
Defense attorney Carl Womack, who was good friends with Art Karp, knew that arguing against the DNA test results was going to be extremely challenging, to say the least.
The only really bad day I had in the whole case was the day I saw the DNA come in and as a match for him, because I figured it was going to be credible. I figured it was going to be admissible. At the pretrial hearing, Tom and I even offered to concede, and I tried to blame it on his blood relatives. Almost got away with it.
The only people who have the exact same DNA are identical twins. Other than that, parents and their children share some matching DNA fragments. Womack tried to bring this up, claiming that perhaps this could create a false positive. But a DNA expert didn't agree, and Art Karp diffused the argument with a wry objection to the judge, saying that Timothy Spencer's mother is not a suspect in this murder. The objection was sustained. For good measure, Karp then asked to approach the bench. Out of earshot of the jury, Karp threatened to bring on the evidence of the DNA matches from the Richmond murders to prove that Timothy Spencer committed these crimes and not any of his relatives. Faced with the prospect of some jurors possibly learning for the very first time that his client was an accused serial killer, Carl Womack quickly agreed to back down from that argument. Womack also tried vigorously but unsuccessfully to poke holes in the handling of the physical evidence. But the police and lab technicians had impeccably documented the chain of custody for the collection and testing of the semen-stained nightgown and sleeping bag collected at the Sue Tucker murder scene. Sue Tucker's widower, Reg Tucker, also took the stand, sorrowfully telling his story of calling home again and getting no answer until a homicide detective finally picked up. And a slew of DNA and forensic science experts testified, discussing both the collection of the evidence and explaining the DNA testing process in detail. One DNA expert would tell the reporters outside the courthouse that DNA is on trial along with the defendant. The Arlington jury hearing the evidence was, on the whole, educated and affluent. Its members included a computer analyst and a lawyer who was a former engineer. They were up to the task set before them.
No, we did not strike gold with our jury. I wore pink socks. I had shocking pink socks on the day that they presented all of this evidence, just to try and distract the jury from this. And I mean, every time I got a chance, I'd pull up my pants, I'd cross my legs.
Aside from possibly being distracted by Carl's socks, the Richmond prosecutors and defense attorneys in the gallery were studiously paying attention to how Helen Fahey and Art Karp argued their case. But one thing they also couldn't fail to notice was how lax the security in Arlington was. By comparison, at the height of the South Side Strangler trials, snipers were posted on one courthouse roof, say attorneys Jeff Everhart and David Johnson. They represented Spencer in his trials for the murders of Debbie Davis and Dr. Susan Helms. Everhart would also defend Spencer for the murder of Diane Cho.
That was his best chance to escape, right? They did a lot of sidebars. There was probably a 60-year-old deputy sheriff standing between him and the door.
Courtroom security was a lot different back then.
Yeah, different world back
This was
then.
an old...
Southern Nightmare will return after this message. Hey Southern Nightmare fans, we have a book coming out. You can go to Amazon.com right now to pre-order the Southern Nightmare Companion ebook, which is coming out September 15th. If you want a deeper dive into the epic story of how the South Side Strangler was brought to justice, you won't want to miss this book. It's going to include lots of extra stuff we didn't have time to get into in the podcast, plus bonus content like interview transcripts and photos. If ebooks aren't your thing, we'll also have a paperback edition coming out. And everyone who donates at the $10 or more level on our Patreon page will get a free copy of the ebook. So you can help us fund Season 2 and get something a little cooler than a tote bag in return. Just go to southernnightmare.com/donate and donate $10 to get your free Southern Nightmare ebook and access to bonus content like extended interviews and a video of our 1-hour live show. Okay, back to this week's episode. Perhaps the strongest evidence the prosecution had, aside from the DNA, was the fact that Timothy Spencer had been furloughed from the halfway house in Richmond to visit his family in Arlington during the Thanksgiving weekend murder of Sue Tucker. Carl Womack says that argument was far from the weakest circumstantial case he'd ever seen, especially given the fact that he himself couldn't account for Spencer's whereabouts during the murder. Spencer was quiet around Womack and didn't volunteer loads of information for his own defense. He maintained his innocence and claimed that he had been with his family the entire Thanksgiving weekend, but that didn't check out.
We couldn't provide him with a complete alibi. They went to see his brother's basketball game, leaving him at home for about 2 hours, in the relevant time period, and we couldn't cover it from there.
During the sentencing portion of the trial, when Spencer's mother Thelma was being questioned by defense attorneys about her son, she was asked, "Can you think of anything you might have done or would have done that might have made it all turn out different?" "Yes," she replied. "I shouldn't have called him and invited him here for Thanksgiving in November." After deliberating for 5 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts against Timothy Spencer in the rape and murder of Sue Tucker. The next day, a Saturday, they would hear testimony all day as to whether the case merited the death penalty. A little over an hour later, they sentenced Timothy Spencer to death, prompting the one display of anger he showed during the entire trial.
He walked out and flipped the court off.
This was unquestionably the first capital murder conviction in the United States based on DNA evidence, and that alone makes it an historic, landmark verdict. It was also the first time in the world that a serial killer had been caught and convicted using DNA. What's a little murkier is whether, as some people claim, it's also the first U.S. murder conviction based on DNA evidence. Prior to this case, one killer in the entire world had been identified by a DNA test in England, but he pleaded guilty and there was no trial. Another defendant in Florida had been convicted of rape based on DNA evidence. And at virtually the same time that DNA evidence tests were being performed in the South Side Strangler murders, DNA testing was also being done for a September 1987 murder in New York State. That case was successfully prosecuted in early 1988, and while DNA results were introduced at trial, it was far from the sole factor in that conviction. Police in that case had other strong evidence, including a witness and the defendant's own statements tying him to the crime. Regardless of how one chooses to classify it, however, the verdict against Timothy Spencer was big news. It was reported by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the big news magazines of the day. And it set lasting legal precedents, says retired Arlington homicide detective Joe Horgus.
The reason this case is really so important is it's not the first DNA case, but it's the first capital murder DNA case. And because it was capital murder, it automatically went to the Supreme Court, you might say. And when they wouldn't hear any evidence contrary to the conviction, you might say that set the precedent for DNA to be used in the courtroom, so that today you don't have to put on all your expert witnesses and prove DNA. It's accepted now.
Despite the fact that he already had one death sentence, Timothy Spencer refused to plead guilty to the other 3 murder charges he faced. Prosecutors were not going to offer Spencer any plea bargains. The families of his victims demanded justice. And because DNA evidence was so new and they believed Spencer was so dangerous, prosecutors wanted to have multiple capital convictions against him in the unlikely case any of his future appeals might be successful. Going to trial, though, meant that the victims' families would have to relive the trauma again and again. Marcel Slag would have to testify about coming home to discover his strangled wife's still warm body. And Debbie Davis's father, Bill Dudley, spent what would have been Debbie's 36th birthday testifying in court about being the last person to speak to his daughter before her murder, recalls family member Eric Fisk.
It's very difficult. Bill and Josie left the courtroom when the medical examiner got on the stand and they explained the medical aspects of her death. Bill and Josie couldn't stand that. But it was a very tough week for them.
Debbie Davis was the first Richmond woman to fall victim to the man described as the South Side Strangler. Timothy Spencer's trial for her murder will take place here at the Manchester Courthouse September 19th. Spencer appears here under heavy guard for a series of legal motions.
Former Richmond Assistant Prosecutor Jack Driscoll argued the murder trials of Debbie Davis and Dr. Susan Helms with the late City Commonwealth's Attorney Aubrey Davis. The average inner-city Richmond juror back then didn't have much formal education, and so Driscoll knew he couldn't use the same science-heavy approach favored by Arlington. Instead, his strategy was to simplify the argument. When Timothy Spencer committed the murders, Driscoll told the jury, Spencer had left behind a calling card, his own DNA. And there are people who can read that DNA, just like a fingerprint. From there, Driscoll would dazzle the jury with an array of impressive, top-notch scientists, professors, and medical experts. All you had to know, Driscoll says, is that the guys who were on the stand were super smart, super knowledgeable, experts in their field, and that they relied on DNA in their jobs. You get that across, and then you've won your case. As for the defense, Jeff Everhart and David Johnson's approach was also simple.
Try to cast doubt on a new science.
Yeah, because in our case, that's all there was. We were pointing out as best we could, there's nothing else here. This is all they have, and it's really brand new and untested. They use some awfully big numbers, too.
One of the lead witnesses for the prosecution was Dr. Michael Baird, senior scientist and laboratory director at Life Codes, the New York lab that had performed the DNA testing. Baird, who holds a doctorate in genetics, testified that there was only a 1 in 135 million chance that the DNA found at the crime scene would match any African-American male other than Timothy Spencer. At that time, the entire African American population in the United States was only about 28 million. In 1988, there were no government DNA databases in existence, so labs like Life Codes were basing their odds calculations on relatively small numbers of individual samples they had on file, sometimes only 1,000 or more. So Jeff Everhart and Dave Johnson were concerned that the scientists were vastly overinflating their estimates. But due to the fact that some of the leading DNA experts in the nation were testifying for the prosecution, the defense attorneys couldn't find any witnesses who would contradict them.
It would have been nice to have had an expert to help us, but we could not get anybody to help us.
It wasn't just that it was new. The prosecution pulled out all the stops, and their experts were the superstars in the science community at the time.
By January 1989, Spencer had also been found guilty for the rape and murders of Debbie Davis and Dr. Susan Helms. He now had 3 death sentences against him. After Spencer was convicted for Debbie Davis's murder, Spencer's younger brother Travis, then 17, testified on the witness stand during the sentencing hearing, saying, "DNA took my brother." Richmond Commonwealth's attorney Aubrey Davis shot back a correction, saying, "DNA did not take his brother's life. DNA found the killer of 3 women. Timothy Spencer put his life in jeopardy. Timothy Spencer deserves no mercy." Southern Nightmare will return after this message from Audible. Hey, Southern Nightmare listeners. If you listen to podcasts and books on the go like I do, you need to try Audible. They're offering you a free audiobook download of your choice to keep with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. They've got over 180,000 titles to choose from, and you can listen on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. True crime fans can't go wrong with one of my favorite audiobooks, Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets. It's written by David Simon, who you might better know as the creator of HBO's The Wire. Back in the 1980s, when he was a newspaper reporter, he spent an entire year following the Baltimore City Homicide Squad. If you want to know what it's like to be a homicide detective, this is your book. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Southern Nightmare. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Southern Nightmare for your free audiobook. Less than 4 months later, in May 1989, Spencer would stand trial for the murder of 15-year-old high school freshman Diane Cho. This last trial is especially notable for the fact that it marked the first time that PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, DNA testing was used in a murder trial. The semen recovered at the Cho murder scene was contaminated with menstrual blood and bacteria, and the sample size wasn't as large or pure as that recovered at some of the other murders. So, lacking a good DNA sample, the prosecution's strategy this time around was to prove that the method of Diane Cho's murder, entry through a window, binding, raping, strangling the victim, matched Spencer's signature rituals as a convicted serial killer. But the prosecution also employed this new cutting-edge PCR testing process, which could amplify degraded DNA samples. In 1989, PCR testing was still new and nowhere near as refined as it is today. So while the amplified sample from the Cho murder did match Spencer's DNA, scientists at the time could only give 1 in 100 odds for it belonging to anyone but Spencer. Nevertheless, this breakthrough testing method would go on to win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1993. The next time it made big news would be in 1994, when it would be used in the O.J. Simpson trial. Aside from being another landmark moment for forensic science, the Cho murder trial also yielded some dramatic moments straight out of a movie. It began when Diane Cho's mother took the witness stand to recount how she had found her daughter's body. Mrs. Cho became so rattled by seeing Spencer in person that she asked if she could say a prayer before her testimony.
In the Chesterfield case, Diane Cho's mother testified, and there was a translator, and she was Korean. Diane Cho's mother was Korean, and the translator, when she started to testify, she asked, may she say a brief prayer? Well, what are you going to say?
You're not going to object.
It's hard to object to that.
I asked to pray, time to pray, 그래서 기도하면서
And I was praying.
자세히는 생각 안 나는데
I couldn't remember
한
verbatim.
가지만 생각이 나요.
I remember one thing. Please let him repent and let him speak honestly what he did to my daughter.
So her mother started speaking in Korean, and I don't understand Korean. But as she prayed, her voice started to rise, and very loudly, she, Spencer! And she screamed, Spencer.
Former Chesterfield County prosecutor Billy Davenport, who argued the Cho murder case, told me that it was so emotional that some of the jurors and some of us had tears in our eyes because of the heartfelt impact of her grief. It came through no matter the language. During questioning, Davenport handed Mrs. Cho a photo of Diane, and she clutched it to her chest, sobbing. Deputies had to take the picture from her when she wouldn't give it back to be submitted into evidence, which made her cry harder. Davenport called for a break. And then, as Mrs. Cho stepped down from the witness stand and walked past the defense table, something snapped inside of her. She lunged at Spencer.
It was like my heart was bursting. Just my chest is just
내 딸이
an explosion.
Davenport ran between Mrs. Cho and Spencer, separating them, while the bailiff and armed officers secured Spencer. Because Spencer was a high-profile death row inmate, the court was being guarded by correctional officers, as well as sheriff's deputies and plainclothes police.
I actually wanted to kill him. My daughter was just full of future.
너무 아까운 내 딸 왜 다 놓고 와 하필이면은
Why did you do that to my daughter? She is just full of hope and future. She has so much to offer, and I couldn't control myself.
Due to the outburst, Davenport excused Mrs. Cho from testifying. The defense was also worried that her tears and anger would sway the jury.
That was the only time I went to the court.
Later that same day, as a thunderstorm was passing through, a Richmond detective was showing crime scene photos from the Davis and Helms murders to the jury. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the courtroom into complete darkness. What followed next was total chaos, Jeff Everhart says.
You heard holsters unsnap. The judge took a dive. Spencer was to my right, and I said, "Don't move. Whatever you do, do not move." And I'm telling you, people in the courtroom screamed. It was bizarro world. It was one of the maybe the eeriest experience in my entire life.
As for the jurors, they wanted out of there, Davenport remembers. The tension was unbelievable. It seemed like an eternity before the emergency lights kicked in, but it was really only a few seconds. And that wasn't the only unnerving moment during the 8-day trial. In fact, at one point, the entire courtroom would have to be evacuated due to a terrorist bomb threat. Finally, on Friday, May 12, 1989, after deliberating for nearly 4 hours, the jury made its decision.
The jury found Spencer guilty of the rape and murder of Diane Cho, a 15-year-old county girl.
Jeff Everhart would argue against the death penalty, telling the jurors it wasn't necessary because, with 3 death sentences under his belt, his client was already a walking dead man. But after just 47 minutes of consideration, the jury handed down Spencer's 4th and final death sentence. Timothy Spencer, the South Side Strangler, had been on trial for almost 10 months.
The other thing I remember is Timothy Spencer's mother in Chesterfield saying that, she said it's like going to the play. You've seen the same play over and over and you know the outcome. Because by that time was the 4th one. Those cases were all exhausting, and even though you kind of expect or anticipate the result, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. A jury would be hard-pressed to give a person life having heard the circumstances and the details of those and seeing the pictures of those women's demise. You know, those women all suffered. I mean, these were not quick deaths.
So, given the fact that Spencer maintained his innocence throughout 4 capital murder trials, you may wonder, is there any chance he didn't do it? Jeff Everhart and Dave Johnson say at the time they defended Spencer, they weren't sure.
We always had some doubts along the lines of, what could we have done differently? What could we have done better? And was he really guilty? And, everything tells you, the scientific evidence tells you he's guilty. But at least for me, I always had some residual doubt.
Well, and I think a lot of that came from Timothy. I mean, he was a very good client. Polite, quiet, not demanding, insistent on his innocence.
Everhart and Johnson decided to do something extraordinary. They surreptitiously submitted a sample of Spencer's blood to a DNA testing lab under a fake name and asked the lab to compare Spencer's DNA to the killer's DNA profile.
Sure, we were hoping it would be something exculpatory. But we arranged to have a sample of his blood sent to a lab in Winston-Salem, right, North Carolina, that did paternity testing, and they could do the genetic testing, and it came back that it was him.
Defense attorney Carl Womack says he'll always be proud that he gave Timothy Spencer the best defense he could, because everyone is entitled to that under our justice system. But losing the case, he believes, also served justice.
Yeah, this was Tim Spencer was, whoever did this, not a good person in many respects. Certainly didn't deserve to walk on the face of the earth with free people anymore.
Next time on Southern Nightmare.
When it happened, we were all, of course, just shocked because we knew there was no way in the world that David could have possibly done such a thing. David, like I said, was just one of the sweetest people you ever want to meet, and he was very childlike. There's no way he could have done what they said. And they really tricked him into confessing. And that was horrible.
Southern Nightmare is a production of True South Media in cooperation with Style Weekly Magazine and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio. New episodes are released every Tuesday. It's recorded at Sound of Music Recording Studios in Richmond, Virginia. Our producer is John Morand. Original music by Daniel Davis. For exclusive extra web content, visit our website at southernnightmare.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to leave a positive review on iTunes. It helps people find us. We'd like to give special thanks to everyone who gave their time to talk with us for this podcast and to you for listening. Pleasant dreams.